A compound shape in Illustrator is a method in which you can combine drawings and shapes in a single sublayer. So basically, when you create shapes, every time you draw something in Illustrator, you're creating sublayers, and that gets increasingly complex. So one of the ways you can minimize that is to look at combining shapes within a single layer in a compound shape. Now, it doesn't work with everything. So for instance, if I draw a shape and attempt, I don't get access to it using right click, and object compound path make will result in this message. So whenever you see this message, it's telling you you're trying to ask it to do something illegal. It cannot do it. Where it works very well is when I place one drawing on top of another and I ask it to make a compound path, or I can make an actual drawing. Let's grab those two and then make a compound path, and then it will form one single object. So it kind of appears to look a little bit like an inverted clipping mask at this point. And notice what's happening over in the layers. You'll see that from two paths we've now made one. Compound paths get a little bit more complicated when you overlap an object or you use multiple objects. So you can see here I've got two rectangles, and in this section I've got three shapes all in sublayers. So I'm going to ask these two shapes to form a compound shape, and what it does this time is because it's overlapping, it's formed a hole effectively in the middle. And the reason it's doing that is Illustrator, when you combine sublayers, it really will take the easiest route possible. And this is the easiest way for it to create a single path out of two paths. So obviously you can do similar things with the Pathfinder tool, and you might find a more appropriate Pathfinder tool if you simply wanted to join those two objects. But another way that you might do it is just simply to use the good old shape builder tool, and that will give you a single shape. And then of course this could form a single clipping mask as well. So again, this is a more complex set of shapes, 3 sublayers at the moment. And if I try to make a compound path here, and again, it will look for the simplest routes and find a way to join them. So again, it might be simpler to utilize either the shape builder, or it might be just that you simply put these items into a group, depending on what you're actually trying to do. So if I just form the shape builder through all the shapes, it does it in a more succinct and easy way. So it's knowing when to use the right tools for the job. Where a compound path can get very interesting is if you have several shapes which aren't connected, and then if I just select all of those shapes and form a compound path, you'll see at the moment they're in sublayers. And so if I form a compound path with those shapes, there's nothing to interconnect, so it will just simply form a single layer. And if you're canny with the way that you use compound paths, they can be a really powerful and effective tool. Now I've brought in an image to sit behind the compound path, and I'm now going to ask it to form a clipping mask. So you can see that multiple shapes can form a single clipping mask area, but you need to be careful in the way that you combine the shapes to make it work. So another thing you can do is, obviously we can move the group around, but if I target simply the photographic image behind, then I can shift that image throughout the clipping mask. And you can do this with just ordinary clipping masks as well. In addition, I can bring in other images. So let's just find something to bring in. And providing that is in my clip group, so I'm just literally dragging it in underneath, I can see what other images will look like behind my clipping mask. So it might be a good method to use when I'm trying to fill more complex spaces. And for instance, I've drawn a robot and I've grouped all of the areas. So you can either do that by object group or you can place them in sublayers. So if we have a look in here, I had originally grouped the arms and the bottom of the legs together, the head and the knees and a little bit of the torso and so on together, and then all of the buttons together in the same group too. So if I've formed individual layers, or I've created groups, then I can easily target those groups. In the case of this example, for instance, because I've put several paths into specific layers, then I can grab those layers together, and I can even shift click and add in additional layers as well. That can form a compound path. Now, here we have two sets of sublayers. So I'm just going to grab all of those together and I'm going to make compound path of all of those layers. So you could see they've gone from various individual layers to forming a single sublayer. Object, compound path, make, and we get a single sublayer. So now I can place an image behind that sublayer, grab both, and make a clipping mask. And obviously I don't need to move them over here. I'm just showing you this independently, and you could do it on the actual robot. Likewise, I've got the subgroups for the buttons, so all of these buttons here, and they're all in little independent drawings. And they're in groups. They could, of course, just be a long list of drawings. So long as you have them selected, you can put them into a compound path, forming one single path. And then if I grab both the path and the image, then we can make a clipping mask. Finally, if you needed to undo the clipping mask, you can release clipping mask, and that would just put it back to this form. And of course, if you need to move the image around, then I find the easiest method is just simply to target the image, and then you can manipulate it and you can change the scale of it as well. Okay. With compound paths, it's the same thing. If I've created a compound path, then here is my single compound path from a whole group of paths. I can also just release the compound path as well. And you'll see it will go back to the individual paths. So keep it simple. Don't ask it to do things it cannot do. Combine relative shapes and use them to your advantage. If you need to do other things, then think about using the Pathfinder or the Shape Builder tool, or simply utilizing groups and ungrouping objects.